Okay, it's looking as though everybody is connected to audio. So if you can't hear, message in the chat, but we'll get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're here today joined by two guests, Dr. Amber Silver and Dr. Graham Dwyer, who are going to be talking to us a little bit about sense making, particularly in the context of the end of emergencies. We're going to be hearing first from Dr. Amber Silver, and she's based at the University of Albany in New York. Amber, do you want to get started?
And can you see that okay? Wonderful. So thank you so much for having me. As Kate mentioned, my name is Dr. Amber Silver. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Emergency Management and Homeland Security at the University of Albany in Albany, New York. And I am delighted to be here today to talk about the impact of sense of place and place attachment on both short and long-term disaster recovery. So before we begin, I wanted to give just a little bit of information about myself. So I received my PhD in Geography and Environmental Management from the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada. And as such, I would probably loosely describe myself as a behavioral geographer. I am deeply interested in the nuanced and often reciprocal relationship between people and their environment. A great deal of my research has focused on the nexus between weather and society. More specifically, I'm really interested in the ways that weather motivates hazard adjustment, either in terms of preparedness or response. A subset of this research has looked at the relationship between people's sense of place and their recovery-related decisions following severe weather events. So for instance, we did a project on long-term recovery following Hurricane Juan, which affected Point Pleasant Park in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. And the topic of this talk today is looking at long-term recovery in the community of Goderich, Ontario, following a devastating tornado in 2011. So I'm going to sort of do a really quick review or recap about sense of place and place attachment in the context of disasters. The study of people-place relationships is a long-standing tradition in geography, but place is sort of an ambiguous, albeit very meaningful term. The relationships between people and their environment have been conceptualized in different ways by different researchers, and these researchers draw on related but distinct concepts, such as sense of place, insideness, place attachment, placelessness, and others. Taken together, these concepts illustrate the highly effective and oftentimes influential relationship between people and their environment, as well as the meaningful distinction that we as people make between space and meaningful place. Now, the relationship between sense of place and environmental change is a new but growing field in this research domain. Typically, researchers that look at sense of place in disasters tend to look at disasters that cause widespread destruction and displacement. Think disasters on the scale of Hurricane Katrina or the Joplin tornado, things of that nature, where the community is destroyed, essentially. And so the challenges are with displacement and relocation and things of that nature. Oh, sorry. Whoops. There we go, that's better. However, far less is understood about the impacts that smaller scale disasters have on sort of place, sense of place and place attachment. So for instance, with these disasters where you have some parts of the community that are just completely destroyed, but other parts of the community that are relatively unaffected, have a very different set of challenges than disasters on the scale of, say, Hurricane Katrina. Rather than issues of displacement and relocation, or even returning to an area, residents who deal with smaller scale disasters have to deal with living with visible reminders of the event. So every day, day in, day out, seeing what this disaster has done to their community. And this is often a painful reminder of what's been lost. Although this area of inquiry is young and comparatively understudied, the findings thus far suggest that psychology of place is a really important concept in disaster recovery. Accordingly, this study examines the aftermath of an F3 tornado that devastated the community of Goderich, Ontario in 2011. Specifically, I'm going to talk about how residents' sense of place and place attachment affected their mental health and decision-making in both the short and long-term recovery period. First, let me introduce you to the community of Goderich, Ontario. In 2011, the town of Goderich is a small community of approximately 7,500 residents located on the eastern shore of Lake Huron in rural southwestern Ontario, Canada. The downtown area is centered around an octagonal traffic circle, which you can see here. And this is known locally as the Courthouse Square because it is the Huron County Courthouse. The historic downtown area is beautiful. It has cafes and shops and restaurants and ample green space, and all of that is located just a short walk to the shore. In fact, the town's natural beauty led Queen Victoria to state that Goderich was the prettiest town in Canada. And this is a reputation that the residents of Goderich are very proud about. It's on the local, it's on like the municipal website, it's on the town welcome sign, it's on lots of pamphlets and signage for the town. Accordingly, the beauty of Goderich is really important to the people that live there. It's an integral part of their relationship with their community. And that relationship was substantially impacted on August 21st, 2011. Now, on this otherwise nondescript Sunday afternoon, an isolated supercell thunderstorm moved over Lake Huron. And rather than weakening, which is typical of these kinds of storms, it actually intensified as it approached the shore. 12 minutes before 4 o'clock, this was the radar reflectivity. If you're not familiar with radar reflectivity, essentially this is showing an area of intense rotation, and this is sort of the downtown core of Goderich. And 12 minutes later, this storm came ashore directly into that downtown courthouse square. This map gives you an idea of sort of the track of the storm. So it came ashore near the salt mine, and you can see a picture of what that looked like. It caused the most damage in that courthouse square. That's where it got the F3 rating, and it is F3, not EF3, because Environment Canada at the time was using the Fujita scale, not the enhanced Fujita scale. And the storm then tracked about 20 kilometers in a southeasterly direction. Now, I spoke about how very beautiful and idyllic the sort of downtown, the courthouse square was. This is an aerial view of that area before the storm, and this is an aerial view of that area after the storm. So the green space was obviously irrevocably altered. The historic gazebo was destroyed. And as you can see, all of these historic buildings sustained some manner of damage, with some of them being either destroyed or damaged beyond repair and had to be subsequently demolished. As a result of this tornado, 1 individual lost their lives, 5 others required urgent medical assistance, and it was the strongest storm to hit Ontario in 15 years, strongest tornado rather. The damages totaled about 75 million in insured damages, 150 million Canadian total. So very quickly, what we did was that we conducted semi-structured interviews in small focus groups, September to November. We followed that up with a closed-ended questionnaire. And this sort of 2-part study was really valuable, because what it let us do is the semi-structured interviews gave us really rich insights into how the storm impacted people. And then we were able to use the closed-ended questionnaire to see whether and to what extent those findings were consistent over time. And what we found was really interesting. There were positive, sort of negative impacts and positive impacts associated with the tornado. In terms of negative impacts, to I think no one's surprise, there was a great deal of grief and loss that was being expressed by respondents. I had respondents break down crying. I had students or respondents that needed to excuse themselves from the interviews. It was an extremely emotional time for them. And what the results show is that Smaller scale disasters, such as the Goderich, Ontario tornado, are posing a different set of challenges than larger scale disasters like Hurricane Katrina, particularly in the context of the lived experience of disaster. Almost half of the respondents in this study, half, describe themselves as feeling depressed, devastated, sad, etc., by the loss of the aesthetic appeal in their community. And many respondents commented about the difficulty of living in an area that had been irrevocably transformed by a traumatic event and having to live day in and day out with the reminder of that loss. I won't go into sort of read both the quotes, but this it is sort of exemplified very clearly by a 47-year-old woman who is talking about how she grew up in the Goderich area. She lived just outside of town in a forest that had been flattened by the tornado. And she was talking about the grief that she felt that this safe place, her home, was changed, and it was changed forever. Saying things like, I live in the forest. The only time I cried truthfully after the tornado. You get so, it does something to your soul to be in this place when it's so smashed. And part of the thing that's missing was the trees. After the tornado, it was just wrong. Everything, like the landscape, looked wrong, it felt wrong, everything was wrong. And this was a sentiment shared by many respondents. Additionally, the results also demonstrate that place attachment had a salient influence on residents' opinions about demolition and reconstruction. So for example, this image here is of a historic church that was irrevocably damaged and had to be destroyed. And there was a great deal of discussion as which is more painful, leaving this and people seeing the damage, or having it destroyed and knowing, like demolished and knowing that it's gone. So which hurts more, seeing the scars or seeing its absence? Secondly, there's a question about reconstruction. So in Goderich, there was two schools of thought. One, the idea that a lot of the historic buildings that were lost, they were outdated, they were in need of repair. A lot of them had asbestos. So the thinking was, now that they're gone, let's modernize. Let's pull Goderich into sort of the modern age, either with sort of modern architecture, even LEED certified buildings. And the other school of thought was, no, we don't want any of that. We want to make sure that sort of town council preserves the historic feel of Goderich, to make sure that all new construction is going to have that feeling of our Goderich. Another theme that came out was uncertainty, anxiety, and guilt. So a significant portion of respondents reported feelings of uncertainty about the future. So for example, Goderich, because it is so beautiful, relies heavily on tourism. And there was a real fear that because the beauty of Goderich had been damaged, that their tourism industry was going to be similarly affected. And so people said they didn't know whether Goderich was going to survive this event long term. Another theme that came out very saliently and very poignantly was this feeling of guilt. And this is another example of the difference between large-scale disasters like Hurricane Katrina and smaller disasters that have differential impacts in a community. The southern part of Goderich was largely unaffected. Some wind damage, not much to write about. The northern part of Goderich in the courthouse square had a lot of devastation. And so you had people who were, forced to, they went about their daily activities, but they knew that their friends, their family, their coworkers lost everything. And this was really exemplified by a 45-year-old woman who talked about just the sick feeling she felt, even going out to get groceries, because she would say the hardest thing in the days afterwards, because we didn't have damage. I never lost hydro. I never had internet go out. I had phone. We had no damage. You feel guilty because you had all of these other people that we know lost their houses. They lost everything. And you're just like, oh my God, we have everything. They lost everything. But in addition to all of those negative aspects of guilt and anxiety and grief and loss, there was also really profound positives that it sort of came about as this event. Another common and poignant theme was this notion of community. And people said this again and again and again and again, this idea that after the tornado, friends were helping friends, neighbors were helping neighbors, and strangers were helping strangers. And for many people, the tornado contributed to a real sense of community and togetherness. And these are probably three of my favorite quotes from this entire study, people talking about just how meaningful this has been to them. The sense of community came about in, like, they had concerts for survivors, people who were impacted in the community. They sold merch, they did food drives, they did toy drives and clothes drives. They did lots to try to help members of the community. And a 47-year-old woman said, I think it best, said that the disaster has changed this community forever, period, for the better, because now we understand what community really means. For some respondents, this sense of community made them want to help in some way, whether in terms of debris removal or revitalization of the community. So I know I'm running out of time, so just very quickly, there was some tension in Goderich because the town was only going to remove trees that fell on public property. They weren't going to remove trees on private property. And Goderich has a large aging population, and it has a large population living at or below the poverty line. So a lot of people couldn't remove the trees on their own property. So people organized through Facebook, and they would basically post an address and a time, and people showed up in droves. Sometimes, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 people would show up at this person's house with trucks and chainsaws and safety equipment and would help take care of those trees. Another way that people sort of came together was through regreening or revitalizing the community. Again, the trees that were lost on private property, the city wasn't able to help with that. And so there was volunteer groups such as the Goderich Trees Project that came together to fundraise to help replace trees on private property. And there was a big push for regreening and revitalizing. And in fact, participants overwhelmingly agreed that they felt closer and more connected to their community as a result of their experiences in August 2011. This was particularly true in the context of volunteerism, such as debris removal and regreening the community. In fact, the notion of revitalizing Goderich was so powerful, it became such a powerful metaphor for the community that the 1-year monument to the Goderich tornado is a metal sculpture of a tree, a broken tree, showing signs of regrowth, with the words "nature giveth and taketh away" inscribed on it. So in conclusion, the Goderich tornado had a substantial impact on sense of place and place attachment to the community members, which had a very real impact on the lived experience of recovery in both the short term and the long term. The negative effects include feelings of grief and guilt and loss, even when people weren't directly impacted, but the positive feelings improved sense of community and togetherness that lasted well into the long-term recovery phase, sort of well after the so-called honeymoon phase typically predicted by the literature. And so just very quickly, thank you to everyone who had anything to do with this project. You're all very much appreciated. And I don't know if we are doing questions now or if we want to have the second speaker and then do questions, but I thank you so much for your attention. It's greatly appreciated.
Thank you so much, Amber. And yes, we will do questions at the end. So Graham, we'll go over to you now.
Thanks a million, Kate, and Amber, thank you for that fabulous presentation that evoked so many memories for me in relation to the people who have kindly participated in my research over the past 5 years. A lot of the people who participate in my research are the first responders, the firefighters, the volunteers. But what's interesting about the dynamic here is that many of the volunteers are firefighters, first responders, but they live in many of the communities that are impacted by the fires. Specifically, what I'll be talking about is one particular event, Black Saturday, which happened in 2009, 7th of February 2009, still regarded as Australia's worst ever day of landscape fire that brought into existence a whole series of crises and losses. What I'd love to do is to begin with a very short video that is probably where I am with the research that I'm doing at the moment, which is looking at the effect of memory, what it evokes and what it gives rise to amongst firefighters, looking at the event that was Black Saturday that continues to live in systems, processes, and memories of many of the firefighters right through to today. So I might share my screen. If Amber was telling me before, if I share screen and press the video, we should be able to watch this video. So just bear with me a moment.
Graham, just make sure that you click the share sound box in the bottom left hand on the share screen menu.
Okay, thank you, Amber. I'll give it a go. And let me see, share sound. Maybe if people could give me the thumbs up if they can hear this whenever it starts, that would be great. Can we hear? Yeah, maybe we can't do this. I'm not seeing the share sound button. Oh, I see it there now. One moment.
And the ceremonies we
Can you hear
engage
that?
in around them allow us to.
I do want to be ambitious in sharing this because, like I said, we put so much work into it. It's a shame to not. So here's the video. Thank you.
Physical monuments and the ceremonies we engage in around them allow us to commemorate past events and to pay tribute to people, moments, or acts. By giving monumental form to memory, we continue with our lives, safe in the knowledge that we'll not forget. It's as if the memorial does the remembering for us. But what if the thing we are commemorating were to happen again? Does it make sense to memorialise it and move on with our lives? The commemoration of war, which is done in the hope that it might never happen again, isn't like the commemoration of natural disasters, which are to be expected and which require people to think about and prepare for them. In the years since 2009, memorials have been erected in communities affected by the Black Saturday fires. But the firefighters who fought them are concerned that creating memorials might allow communities and authorities to relegate the fires and their impact to the past. This raises the question, if we are truly to commemorate loss and sacrifice from events like these, shouldn't we seek more effective ways to learn from the past? The commemoration we are familiar with is often deliberate, authoritative, and even managerial in its focus. But this can overlook people's varied experiences and ways of remembering events. Memory is a process, not a thing, and collective memory is an ongoing negotiation through time. It's less about what actually happened and more about how we remember it. So how can we ensure our memories are not frozen in time through symbolism and ceremony? Firefighters describe how they can learn from fires through forms of collective communing, coming together to remember, share stories, experiences, and knowledge. In the narratives of the firefighters, we see how collective remembering can heal and help them make sense of the effect of fires in the present. To help communities cope with the ongoing threat of bushfire, those involved in fighting the Black Saturday bushfires don't want a roll call of heroes. Instead, they want communities to remember the lessons that have been learnt from past fires and for memorials to elicit a call to action. While memorials provide an important space for individual and collective reflection, it is the times between events and anniversaries where learning can occur. Emergency management organisations can support their people by bringing difficult memories and issues related to trauma into the open. In turn, this allows them to support communities to face the inevitable challenges that will come with future bushfires.
So what that video is really a precursor for is my presentation today, which is looking at the role of emotion and how it contributes to sense making otherwise after events, using the case study of Black Saturday, because what I've observed as a former firefighter myself is that we tend to think that we can conveniently normalize the experiences of those who fight the fires. But in actual fact, it's very difficult, because while we might have a public inquiry to look at what happened and why, that conveniently draws an end to the disaster in an institutional sense. But really, it's just a beginning for many of those people who continue to have to face fires. And I've also observed that also in workers in relation to COVID-19 over the past number of years as well, where what we're doing is building this cohort of people who we're referring to as heroes, but we don't actually see what they carry and what they live with as a result of the work that they actually do. I'd also like to just say too that I acknowledge that most of this work was conducted on Wurundjeri country. And I feel often if we just accepted that we live on the most fire landscape area in the world in Victoria, we might actually go a long way to understanding the threat that we face with fire. In terms of, I'm having a bit of trouble moving between the slides. Oh, there we go. So this is a paper that was recently published with my co-authors, Professor Cynthia Hardy and Professor Harry Masukas, where we were keen to look at this notion of emotion. And emotions refer to those intense experiences elicited from a target or cause, which often from physiological reactions and action sequences. And we saw that in many of our respondents, people carry emotion right through, both before, during, and after events such as Black Saturday. And something from Steve Warrington here, who's the former chief officer of the Country Fire Authority in Victoria, talks about the Black Saturday tragedy and the intense emotions that accompany it had a profound impact on those in the Country Fire Authority. And he talks about how I, as in he, reflects on it a lot, and seldom does a day pass that something about that day doesn't cross my mind. And that really sets up a lot of what I've heard from many of the respondents. They carry a lot of these complex and difficult emotions that they experience, not only responding to events, but then when they're called before public inquiries to speak about their experiences, and invariably that ends up in some kind of blame. So we have grounded a lot of our work in the theories related to sense making, which is well established in the management and organization literature. And very briefly, it's two components. We have the sensing and the making aspects. The sensing is about, well, it's grounded in identity, construction, or personality. We'll typically look backwards to anchor points retrospectively to make sense of what we're experiencing in the present moment. We'll seek to enact sensible environments. It's a social process, it's ongoing. And we use cues to focus attention on different types of matters to make sense of. And it's always plausible, more so than accurate. So in terms of emotion and sense-making studies, what are the emotions which emerge from sense-making after disasters? These were some of the questions that motivated us. Are they positive, negative, or both? Well, the truth is it's an awful lot more complex, is what we found. And we found within the literature that we know little of the emotional toll different types of crises, disasters, and emergencies have on individuals. But what's interesting is, well, what do those emotions do in terms of the sense that they make or lack of sense that they make? And we also feel that one of our contributions has been, we know a lot about making sense by reflecting on the past, but we know we're going to experience another Black Saturday. Indeed, we have done with the Black Summer fires. So how do people carry those emotions forward into the future to make sense in a prospective kind of way? And how does that emotional contagion that they've experienced from the past actually shape how they respond and react in the moment of response to different types of events? So we interviewed 62 different types of actors across the spectrum of planning, response and recovery in relation to the Black Saturday fire event. And it builds on a series of work that we've been doing, particularly with Professor Cynthia Hardy and myself, where we're interested also in how we learn. And I suppose what's happening here is we're looking at, well, how does emotion shape that learning that occurs, but after major public inquiries? In terms of Black Saturday itself, well, it was actually an event that only took place over 30 minutes, but it gave rise to 173 lives being lost, 3 townships being completely razed, about 2,500 homes destroyed, nearly 8,000 people displaced, and 4 billion worth of damage. And just 2 days after that, we saw a royal commission was called. And what was really interesting, that while many of the people who were called were still actively firefighting, trying to cope and deal with the consequences of many of the events that came about as a result of Black Saturday. So what we saw was that many of the responders were playing this sort of they were operating within 3 different worlds, where they were moving between a performance practice world, an account-giving world, where they come into the Royal Commission, and a reorganized practice world very quickly after Black Saturday. But in terms what we see in the lead up in this performance practicing world, we'd never seen in a day like Black Saturday in Victoria. We can see from one of the quotes there, the data in the week leading up, it exceeded everything we had known before. Everything about that day was going to be worse. We hit 47 degrees on the 7th of February. It's still a record in terms of temperature. During the fires, we saw that a lot of people in leadership roles had to develop crews with very, very little information, and they carried these difficult experiences. The hardest thing that one person had to do was pick a crew. They knew that people were going to see things that will leave a deep impression on the rest of their lives. Your thought was, are you ever going to see these people again? And this builds on a lot of that trauma that many of these people would have lived through 30 years previously with Ash Wednesday bushfires. Very quickly after the event, they found that they were called into a royal commission. And you see these very poignant quotes where one person talks about people that they knew. I remember doing this interview and being in the office, and there's a picture of this person's colleagues, this person, name of the person, wife, and the name of the person, husband. I knew them, they died in the Black Saturday, which was very sad, and indeed it was. And what you found was what people were going into the Royal Commission to talk about decisions that they made. There'd be new updates on deaths. As one person said, you get into the car at the end of each shift and just cry. There was fear everywhere that the fires could blow up again. We all felt guilt, even though it wasn't us that caused the fires. But while all that was extremely difficult for people to carry forwards, there was also this anticipation of being called into the Royal Commission, because it was a quasi-judicial process where people were actually felt that they were being put on trial for decisions that they had to make with, again, virtually no information about what the fire was doing. And as one person commented, I don't think there's anything more profoundly sad than be confronted with the facts of what happened on Black Saturday. The second most confronting thing is to have to equip yourself for the Royal Commission process. Other emotions emerged, such as anger. In terms of one person, they said, it made me so angry. They were crucified, as in people who were called before the Royal Commission, crucified because they didn't get the messages out. They couldn't have done any better, but they were absolutely slaughtered by this Royal Commission. And this, to me, was very, very difficult to see as well, the volunteers who went to fight fires in other areas while their homes burned. As one person said, so many people who had experienced incredibly traumatic events. Some of these people had lost their houses. They lost people they knew, they lost family members, but they still continued firefighting. And the Royal Commission wasn't very sensitive at all to any of this. But then there was also the aftermath of the reorganized practice world, where afterwards they had to make sense of what the Royal Commission recommended. And as one person said here, they were captured by the emotion of the tragedy, as all of us were. That is, the Royal Commission was as well. We all carry the scars and will do so for the rest of our lives. After Black Saturday, the Victorian community needed a person who could sympathetically but dispassionately say, well, what's really going on here? And that never really happened. The commissioners got caught up in this blame cycle that somebody must be accountable for what happened on Black Saturday. Well, here's where it gets interesting is after Black Saturday, as practitioners returned to their workplaces, they were able to use some of these recommendations to begin to make sense. And they found that they were able to come together in a more settled environment. And what we see is that it catalyzed things. It brought so many things forward that we felt we should have looked at whether we liked it or not. We saw new responsibilities. We saw with the fire commissioner, we see that there's one person to report to and one person who's in charge. And I think there was comfort too that, like, the Royal Commission missed many things, but many of these people didn't realize the skills and unique knowledge that they had of firefighting. But as we implemented many of its findings, our confidence and knowledge grew in our ability to deliver change. So these were workers coming back together. But those emotions remain because we know that there will be another Black Saturday or even a smaller event. And as one person commented, each time you go into the State Control Centre, it's like you walk past a ghost. I get anxious just walking in there and doing my role. So there's a little bit of post-traumatic stress that translates into anxiety, where I find I double check everything that I'm doing. So what we kind of have done with this simple model, which our reviewers rejected out of hand, but we found that there was this type of emotional cycle between the different worlds that was primarily negative emotion, but we found towards the end, reflection brought about more of a happier type of emotion. I still think this has merit in an applied sense, even though our reviewers didn't necessarily like this. But what we did do was make a contribution to the fact that the emotion of anxiety does seem to give rise to different types of coping in different practice worlds, which our reviewers did, which I think was something that did get this article over the line with our human relations reviewers. But I just want to draw very quick attention to the fact that the pandemic, which we all have lived through or are living through, depending on your perspective. I really like what Mike Ashley has done here, where he talks about the concern. What he's observed is that I was concerned so he's come to, through art, talking about I was concerned that the bushfire relief and those affected may have been forgotten as we move from one headline to another. And I think that's really important because all of our medical emergency staff, all of our people who are working in retail outlets, who basically kept us all going with support during COVID-19, during lockdown, they too are carrying forward a lot of these emotions. And what's difficult is that we're creating a culture where we're seeing many of our first responders as superheroes, and quite simply, that video that I played at the start and the research that supports that shows that they're not superheroes. They don't wish to be superheroes, but they actually wish that we all take responsibility for a lot of the emergencies, risks, crisis, and disasters, because ultimately we are all responsible, and it shouldn't be the accountability of those who actually have to try and make sense of what are very novel types of experiences. And we continue to see very relatively recently in Melbourne, we saw 3 police officers lose their life on the side of a freeway. And I thought what Shane said to the media was really poignant. It's so traumatic, all of these events for first responders who show up, not just police, firefighters, paramedic. medics, you don't get over these kinds of scenes. They haunt you for the rest of your life. There's something you have to live with, and it's something that will never leave them. And I think that's what we all need to be mindful of in terms of those who respond to these types of events. The crisis, the disaster never actually does end. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. And thank you both for really, really interesting presentations.